been sent across to the Caribbean as indentured servants.
Wow.
Not chattel slaves. There was a difference. They could work off their time, but they would have worked alongside African slaves, which some linguists suggest is where the very strong Irish twang in a lot of Afro-Caribbean accents comes from. Because like if you listen to somebody from like Kerry who's talking away and a lot of the same songs, a lot of those same voices and vowels going about, there's some people in the Caribbean who would hear that and they're like, oh my God, that actually sounds Caribbean.
Hey, welcome to Questioning History, where a bunch of guys with none of the answers ask all the questions. And we are joined here today by John D. Ruddy. How are you?
The victorious John D. Ruddy.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the champion.
The champion.
And of
The
course,
Quebec Slayer.
Yeah.
oh God, I'm not even Quebecois, even though I live here.
Suck it, Watson, suck it.
Oh, the Irish guy's coming after the Watson. Although my ancestry is Scottish, I have one relative from London, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's all right. My dad was born in Scotland. That's no problem.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, Glasgow for my my nana.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Love that.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your channel? Like, let the audience know.
So I started making this channel as so many kind of YouTubers have done over the years. You kind of fall into it, and like you just kind of start making stuff for fun. So like I had the YouTube channel since like 2007. You know, when you were a teenager signing in to watch the age restricted stuff, and because there's had too much blood and gore in it.
Yeah.
You know, and I'd experiment with different things, but ultimately I'd been drawing this character Manny Man since I was about 14 years old. He was always in the corner of my there's a version of him there up on the wall with the big giant eyes. That's Oliver Cromwell, always looking over my shoulder. Yeah, so in about kind of 2012, I trained as a primary school teacher, an elementary school teacher. So in my early days of being out working as a substitute teacher, I found myself in classes, and one of the things that I just really started to enjoy was teaching history and just telling the stories and exploring the stories and putting it into a perspective that the kids could enjoy and could understand. And then in about 2012, I was in Germany. I was working as a youth worker, so I had a group of teenagers over in Germany, and we had to do a presentation on Irish history, and I ended up putting together like a PowerPoint presentation. But it was like, first we had the Stone Age, then we had the Bronze Age with the Celts, and I just clicked it, and then the Vikings came, and then the Normans came, and all of this thing, and it was just clip art from Google. But that was kind of the initial kind of inspiration for me. I was like, that would actually work really well as a video. And so actually it was about this time 9 years ago now, so it was long time ago now, back in 2013. I'd be watching loads of great kind of content creators out there, like the Angry Video Game Nerd I'd been watching since I was about 18, and Lindsay Ellis and folks like that, where it's just like I'd love to have something like that. And indeed, actually, one that was a huge inspiration for the style that I ultimately ended up with was I don't even know, is he still doing it? Zero Punctuation does video game reviews.
Oh,
you might remember.
I know him. Zero Punctuation. Yeah, always very angry, but his writing was super good.
Yeah, and so that kind of style of because of course back in the early days of YouTube, having it kind of short and sweet and, you know, really quick and bite size was a big thing. It wasn't the thing of having a 20-minute video. And so like the first video that I made history based was then in 2013. I had just come off the back of illustrating a history book where I was just like, I want to keep doing some more. It was a book about local history here in Letterkenny. Letterkenny, where the winding swilly flows, by Kieran Kelly. And so I was like, I want to keep on drawing some more Irish history. And so I started using Manny Man to draw, because Manny Man's quick and easy to draw. And so I did that. And then I did Irish history, which took off in Ireland. And then I was like, right, if I do something with a bit more global appeal, it might take off a bit more. So then I did World War One, and that was just as the centenary was about to come in, and back in 2014. And so then naturally after that, did World War Two. Then naturally after that, did the Cold War. And so from there, I just started building on that and like just doing the very kind of broad stuff. And because like the funny thing was, like I think I'm pretty sure I was doing this like before Oversimplified was doing this, and kind of every so often I'm like, I wonder if I had the whole team or whatever production to be able to do that, would I have been able to get that? But we'll never know. But yeah, so ultimately I just kind of kept putting these videos out, and it's just slowly but surely built over time. Like the Cold War video, I think has over like 5 million views now. The whole channel has about 40 million views, which with regards the big YouTubers isn't much, but in this day and age, but it pays for my bills, and it covers my mortgage.
Nice.
So that's been great. But more importantly, other than the paying, is that because history can so easily become boring. And I have had a couple of really boring history teachers in my time. And so I always just had it in mind that history's too important to be boring. And history's too important for people to not even have like a passing knowledge of. So my goal and my constant ethos is just trying to present history in as fun and interesting a way as possible for kids and adults to get into, and to be able to show that it's all right to be unashamedly passionate about history. Like I go into classrooms, I go into like some classes of 4-year-olds where I'd be talking about like some of the ancient Celtic myths, and then in talking with 12-year-olds about like World War II and stuff. But me just going in and being passionate about it and showing about and telling the stories and asking them, and getting them thinking about it, and then getting them asking good questions as well.
Yeah.
Like I have a one-man show that I do mainly for our kids, but adults will get just as much out of it. The teachers love it. Is the evolution of weapons and warfare. And so I just basically I have a whole pile of replica swords and early firearms, just like not even real, like they're cardboard cutouts, but it's just to demonstrate how they changed over time. And then I've got a big screen up the back showing like the armor and stuff. And at the end of each show, I always do questions and answers at the end, and I always kind of bring it to a point where, as much as I love exploring all of this stuff and all the swords and learn about all the killing and all the shooting and all of that, and how the battles work and all that and how really fun it is, I always have to kind of bring it back and remind myself and remind the audience as well, and just say, all of this was real and all of this happened, and like for all of the cool things of this was where people killed each other, and people are continuing to kill each other. And so all of this, history is complex in that way too, and it's very easy to simplify history into what would win in a fight, a samurai or a knight or a European knight. But and those debates have their place as well. But there's also then the kind of thing of bringing it into the real world and going, this is where we're at. But there's always a kid in the audience who will ask, and they'll ask, so why did like all of the wars start? And I was just like, that's the crux of the whole thing,
Well, there's some other really interesting questions that these kids have.
It's so good, and like because when they're asking questions like that, they're thinking. And the answer that I give to that one is that, to simplify it right down to the bare bones, almost always it is land, and religion and race will often be excuses, but more often than not, it is land. I want that land and what is contained within that land, and I don't want to have to deal with you to get that. So I'm just going to cut out the middleman and I'm going to take that over. And I'm either going to control you or I'm going to wipe you out, you know? And, you know, sadly that's war broken down into its bare bones. And you can dress it up as much as you want about politics and about race and about creed, but at the end of the day, it is one group saying we want to control what you have, and we don't, you know, and we don't want to have to deal with you about it, you know.
Trying to come up with some wars that weren't about land, and it's very difficult.
You could argue that the Aboriginals in like Northern America didn't fight for land per se, but they were fighting for hunting territory, and it moved around a lot of the nomadics.
All right.
Yes,
but that's a quasi.
But that's semantics, you know. Exactly. When it all and to be honest, with regards of what they were fighting for, the colonists were very much fighting for the land. You know.
Yeah.
The War of Jenkins' Ear was for an ear.
Yeah.
Wow. So could you tell us some more of like these questions that you've received that are the ones that impacted you the most, like made you think yourself?
Yeah. I suppose that's what's great about working with kids, because they'll ask the really honest questions that sometimes adults might be even kind of too uncomfortable to ask. Like, because when I'll be doing a workshop on like World War II, and we'll talk about anti-Semitism and just breaking it down and asking them. So it's just like what is a Jew? Who are Jewish people, and where where does that come from? And this whole thing of because then I bring it back into like medieval times, and like this is something that I was actually shocked. I didn't realize that the whole yellow badge thing was a medieval.
St. Louis.
I hadn't realized that, and because then in England as well, you had Edward the Longshanks, or no, it was his father Henry III. They had to wear a yellow badge. It was the tablet of Moses that they wore before they were expelled in 1190 or whatnot, or 1290, whatever it was. But how depressing it is, how so many of those tropes, how many of those old stereotypes continue to be repackaged and repeated to this day. Like I was reading about the one, it was a young boy in Lincoln in England, and he was found dead at the bottom of a well, and the people blamed the local Jews and how they had kidnapped him and sacrificed him to their gods and did all sorts of blood stuff. And it's just like, this is QAnon. Like, it's the same shit repackaged into a different time.
To add something on to this, it's I was really fascinated that like so because I'm doing a humongous series on the First Crusade, right? And the First Crusade starts off, and you know, the call to crusade, it's this whole propaganda thing and very carefully executed marketing by Emperor Alexios. And the truth is that at the time Jerusalem was doing kind of okay. What fascinated me is doing the backstory for it is that almost 100 years prior, there was a man we now call the Mad Caliph, who straight up went to Jerusalem and demolished the temple, and not the temple, the Holy Sepulchre. Like the Holy Sepulchre, which is this incredibly important site for Christianity, was completely destroyed. And because before and after this event, Christians were going on pilgrimages to this place over and over and over again. People saw this, they reported it back home, and the people were furious. So rather than blame mostly the Mad Caliph, what Christians decided to do was blame the Jews. They said that the Jews actually paid the Caliph to do it. That is such an outlandish thing to think. And I remember reading books about how at that time, at the 11th century, which you can see like the origin of the Middle Ages, that hate for Jews, like starting around that time, it's like there was a shift in the understanding of Islam from the outskirts, where the border regions, where the Reconquista, they had dealings with Muslim all the time, and they were not as extremist, even though they were fighting against them all the time. They knew them. They knew they were human. They didn't go as far as to paint them as these demons. They didn't like them at all, but not to the extent that the French people later started to dislike them. The other place of conflict was Sicily and modern-day Turkey. In the 11th century, for the first time, we see a shift in the understanding of both Islam and Judaism start coming out from places like Germany and France and northern Italy, which didn't have contact with these people. So it's always a great lesson to tell people that, like, the more you're in contact with you are with a certain religion or race, the more tolerance there tends to be, because you realize that at the end of the day, we're all people. And it's a very sad reality, because shortly after you get the First Crusade, you get St. Louis, you get the Yellow Badges, you get hundreds of Torah books gathered in the streets of Paris and burned, several wagons full with them. But before I make this super dark, something you said was really cool. Like, history can often be boring. And adults, I think, there's a level of, like, what you said, like, uncomfortability to ask certain questions. We're like, but I think the bigger chunk comes out of people being too ashamed of being, oh, you don't know when the First World War started, or you don't know this. And we, a lot of people as adults, they decide they don't want to risk that chance of embarrassment. So they're not interested in it at all. They just say, oh, history is not for me. Or proudly proclaim they don't know anything about history. And I see it in our videos, in our comment section. It's like, the young kids, of which many watch YouTube, asking decent questions that, who are the Jewish people, or what is Judaism? People start mocking them in the comments. Oh, how could you not know? That's silly. Oh, go read a book, go open a Wikipedia page. This is so much not what we are supposed to do. And I think high school mentality and tests make people have that mentality.
And I mean,
what do you guys think?
High school can be a very tribal thing. Craig, I've been chatting a lot, so you can weigh in on this.
Talking about high school, I work for an Aboriginal reserve in Quebec. And mostly we have 3 schools, but mostly for the high school. So I deal a lot with those students. And it's not representative of, like, other schools. Let's say they have a completely different way of looking at history. It's built upon the oral traditions of their people, Ganyakahaga, so they're Mohawks. And it's interesting because you get to see narratives play out in history. And I live in a place where there's a lot of turmoil between the Quebec government and this Aboriginal group. There was a crisis called the Oka crisis in the 90s. And for lack of better words, they don't like each other. But they've the history narrative that's certainly pushed by a lot of the youth now for them is to hate the French. But if you look at the grand scheme of things, when it came to Nouvelle France and the British, the French were kind of better to them than the British, and now it's changed as a result of contemporary issues like the things that have happened in the 1990s. And it's interesting to see how attitudes have completely gone 180 towards certain groups. And I can just say that there's a danger in history where people, they are led to believe certain narratives, and it influences how they see the world.
I mean, that can be said, but perspective is a huge part of history, and that's a comment that I quite often will get in my videos, in particular the video made about the presidents of the United States, because once I got kind of beyond Nixon, I got,
touchy areas.
Because they're like, oh, it just all of a sudden got really biased. I was like, no, I'm just pointing out the bits. Like, none of what I'm saying is untrue, and nobody is unbiased. Like, you can't be unbiased. And my kind of response to whenever people are like, oh, you're so biased, I was like, yeah, because I trust my audience to be able to spot that, like I'm not going to come out and say, oh, well, I'm going to have to balance this up. But not whenever I think it's, predominantly negative what something was. It's like, well, maybe I should balance out the Nazi equation. No, there are some things in history that are bad, actually. Although, you know, that, like, talking about the kind of Aboriginal perspective on history and stuff, I find this very interesting. Like, my wife's Canadian, and so we've had some very interesting conversations regarding the relationship between, you know, the colonists and the Aboriginal people. And for myself, as an Irish person with the history of Ireland, me personally, I would find much more semblance. I would find much more kind of a relationship with the Aboriginal story, the multiple Aboriginal stories of being colonized. Even though, yeah, I'm white, and there are loads of white Irish colonists out there now, but, you know, having descended from people who, at least my people, didn't move at least too far. And this is like, I've cousins all across Canada and America and England and loads of places. But with regards the Irish perspective on it, and my Irish perspective on it, you know, I can understand the frustration with no, we're not British, you know, or this whole kind of attitude of, yeah, but why can't you just do it the way that we do it? Because, like, the way that we do it's so much more straightforward, you know. And it's like, yeah, for you it is. Like, the way that we had been doing it is fine, but, you know, and just that there's a lot of what they call, you know, to decolonize your mind, of this idea of these little things in your mind that you don't even realize are there. You know, like, I constantly kind of bring up the fact that English is my first language, you know, and now I can speak Irish. I'm not great at speaking Irish, but I can speak Irish. But the Irish language has struggled in Ireland, even though technically it is an official language here.
John, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you, because like, I did a video on the Indo-European languages, right? And I followed not every single branch. We intend to finish it, but I followed most of them, and I did an overview. And in doing my research, I was stunned to find out, and this could be wrong, but but what I read, it was that the Welsh is the most pronounced Celtic language today, and in fact, more people speak Welsh than all of the other Celtic languages combined.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And I looked at it, and it's like, yeah, Ireland has a lot more people, but Wales does a better, or they try harder to
Wales.
Can you explain more about that?
I'm not sure about the specific revival timeline of the Welsh language, but they have had a very successful campaign to revive and maintain the Welsh language. I actually went to Wales in 2019 on my honeymoon, and it's wonderful. Like, there were some areas, like up in Snowdonia, there's lovely wee town Bettysacood. And I went into the shop and just hearing the local guys speaking Welsh. And now it's, so within the Celtic languages, there's two kind of main branches of Celtic languages, where you've got the Brittonic and the Gaelic, and Welsh, Cornish, and Breton would be Brittonic, and then
Brittonic.
Irish Manx, and Scots Gaelic. So like, I could listen to Scots Gaelic and I'd understand a lot of it. You know, it's very similar because it actually came from Irish. The Scots were Irish, ironically.
Once you couldn't swim.
But yeah, so like, in Ireland, it is taught from the age of 4 all the way up to the age of 18, and a major problem with it is no, and there are areas, they're called Gaeltacht areas, of areas where Irish is the first language spoken by people. But the major problem with the Irish language, for the most part, is that 99.999% of people who speak Irish also speak English. Like, I'm not even sure if an Irish speaker exists who doesn't speak English. Now, there'll be Irish speakers who will refuse to speak English, but that's a different story.
Are there Welsh speakers who don't speak English?
That's a good point. Probably not. You know, probably not. But I mean, there's probably loads of Gaelic or Irish speakers who might be watching this going, John, you're doing a disservice to the Irish language. Don't get me wrong, I love the Irish language, and we have an old saying in the Irish language: "Cheer gan anam, cheer gan changa, cheer gan anam," and that is a country without language is a country without a soul. And so, like, the Irish language was very close to being wiped out in the 1870s, with the famine having half the population of Ireland in a couple of decades. Population of Ireland in 1845 was 8 million. By the 1890s, it was about 4 million. And there were more Irish speakers living in America than there were living in Ireland.
That's crazy.
So the Irish language was literally being beaten out of children in schools. So, like, when I hear a lot of the stories of, like, say, like, a lot of the schools, and now don't get me wrong, the residential schools in Canada were horrendous, and there are some parallels with Irish history as well, because Ireland and Catholic run schools were also quite horrendous, and there were also you know, mass graves found at other Catholic run institutions here in Ireland. So, you know, I very much see a lot of parallels. And I was actually speaking with a person a couple of weeks ago there, what's the Métis. And so we were chatting away and chatting about a lot of those parallels. And obviously, you know, Irish people ultimately historically have had the white privilege, you know, the ability to hide the Irish accent and just become American or become Canadian or become English, and all of a sudden you just blend in, you know. Whereas a person of color, not as easy to hide, which I suppose is why the Jews had to wear the badges, you know, to make sure that they stuck out.
True.
Or live in confined quarters that are reserved just for them. What you say is so interesting, and I think a lot of people who live in monogamous language countries don't realize that language has a cultural role, and it also has like this economic convenience role. And Ireland, you say that very well. That's like, you don't really have a choice to not speak English. And something on a more complicated and bigger scale is, I think, Ukraine. And with Project Ukraine, many videos touched on that. The fact is that most Ukrainians can speak both Ukrainian and Russian. But there are some Ukrainians who only speak Russian in the zones that are more closely. So if you find yourself in a room with 10 people, and 7 of them speak Ukrainian and Russian, and all 10 of them speak Russian, to just live in a harmonized society, those 7 are just going to go, fine, we'll speak Russian. But that doesn't make us Russian. But in that little thought bubble we just made, there's a huge convenience for you to align yourself with the majority. And it's funny because the people who decide to join the other 3, they're not nationalistic. It's the opposite. Because if they were nationalistic, they would just go, you know what, fuck you 3. We're just gonna hang tight here. We 7 will speak our language. You 3 speak yours, even though we understand you. We're just gonna be deaf to your language. So it's funny how nations like that, and it hasn't happened just in Ukraine, it's all through history. It's like nations trying to accommodate more people, trying to be more tolerant, end up suffering those decisions. It's so tricky. Like the Ottoman Empire could have actually really said to the people, you must speak Turkish or this Balkan language and no other. But they didn't. They said, speak whatever you want. And then problems arose. It's such a complicated thing. It's such an integral part. In history, in wars, we speak so much about the role of religion. I don't think much is being taught or told about the story of language and how they played into wars and stuff.
Oh, big time.
I guess I'm different from both of you because everything about Quebec is a war over language. Every identity of Quebec is the survival of the French language. It's the identity of everything. So
I love how we can connect here and like different parts of the world, but so much in common. Love history. But sorry, go on.
And might I add that the Irish population in Quebec is very unique. Irish Studies is its own department at the university I went to. Yeah, so you have your history department, but Irish Studies is its own unique thing. Part of town is Griffintown, famously built up by the Irish. And to this day, I mean, a lot of the Anglophone populations left Quebec because of...
Because that's a very interesting one, because there's almost like a double layer of colonialism there, you know, or it is a double layer. And so, like, you know, with the French being the first colonists, and they're kind of like, you know, oh, you're encroaching on, and that's an age-old thing from you know, way back, of because even the Catholic Protestant aspect of it as well was there.
There's a huge aspect to that, because when the Irish came over, they were all of a sudden another Catholic group. So you think, like, oh, we both hate the British, but no, but they were antagonistic. There was raids and battles. The Quebecois hated the Irish. The Irish.
Why?
It's a very strange part of history. You just have to see it from this way. The Quebecois are, I'm sorry to say this, because like, je me souviens, you know, je m'excuse. Anyways, for all the French Quebecois who might be listening, the Quebec narrative is a lot of wrongs to it, and they vilify the British far too much. If you go to India and ask India about the history of colonialism, it was brutal. It was terrible. Go anywhere around the world, terrible. Quebec, I'm sorry, you were treated like princesses.
But I don't understand. They were white. As you said, they had so much common with Catholicism and hating the British.
Fighting for resources. Because they saw it as a threat to their area. There's like, oh, they're a Catholic group, but they're more in line with the British than us. Oh, they might overthrow us. Our language is dying, because French is a difficult language to write. It's always you go to even if you talk to people in France today, the French language is dying. They'll always bring this up. It's hard for them to retain the language. So the Irish could have taken over Quebec. I mean, they did try to take over Canada technically at one point. So, but yeah, there's a huge antagonistic relationship between the Quebec and the Aboriginals of Quebec, Quebec the British, Quebec and the Irish. It's just always like that.
Yeah.
Damn. The Irish, like, okay, so someone explained this to me. There are all these immigrant groups, right? And Ireland always pops up as one of the biggest, but they go to these places and they really build their own communities. Like, what's the level of Irish people being like, we are going to go to this new place, we're going to immigrate here, we're going to integrate? Obviously, you can say the Irish people are extremely adaptable, because look at them. Did they, were they like isolating themselves from the rest of the community and not wanting to really...
They were being excluded.
Yeah, they were being excluded in a lot of ways. So like the earliest points of like Irish people en masse being moved would have been like in the 1650s, where they would have been sent across. In the wake of Oliver Cromwell, they would have been sent across to the Caribbean as indentured servants.
Wow.
Not chattel slaves. There was a difference. They could work off their time. But they would have worked alongside African slaves, which some linguists suggest is where the very strong Irish twang in a lot of Afro-Caribbean accents comes from. Because like, if you listen to somebody from like Kerry who's talking away, and a lot of the same songs, a lot of those same voices and vowels going about, there's some people in the Caribbean who would hear that and they're like, oh my God, that actually sounds Caribbean, you know. and I wasn't doing a Caribbean accent there, that was a Kerry accent.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of that same kind of sounds ended up in the Caribbean, because they would have learned their English from the indentured servants who they'd be working beside, or sometimes who would also be the foreman. But then the second major wave would have been famine times, 1840s all the way up through to the 1900s, of going particularly into North America. Loads of Irish went to England. Loads of Irish went to America. Loads of Irish were sent as prisoners to Australia. But in North America, because that was the second big wave of Europeans moving across, where like you had the the Dutch and the English and some of the Germans, but they were Protestant. They were the WASPs. But now all of a sudden in the 19th century, you have the Italians and the Polish and the Irish coming over, and they're all Catholic. And that was so much of a bigger thing then of, oh no, they're loyal to the Pope, not to the president and all of this. But the Irish in particular, because they had been so dehumanized by the British, like the Irish were seen as a different race. And like you see these old manuals and illustrations of the Irish.
What was white is different.
Yeah, you know, the Teutonic, you know, straight sliding nose, and then the Irish, these big apes, essentially, you know.
Damn.
And that was, you know, big hairy knuckles, you know, drunken Irish and all of that stuff. So when the Irish particularly came to America, they were the second last rung, because of course, let's face it, the slaves, or the formerly enslaved people, were the very bottom, but they were tussling for that same space. So like during the Civil War, during the American Civil War, like there were riots in New York, where the now there's a fictionalized version of it in the Scorsese movie Gangs of New York, but those riots did happen, and it was basically Irish people getting pissed off with loads of black people coming in and undercutting them for work. But that's classic capitalism. It's classic class warfare. You know, if you all realize that you're all getting screwed by the system from above.
Yeah,
but that's it, divide and conquer, and the Irish sadly fell for that a very long time, and the Irish sadly stepped on the faces of those to clamber up the social ladder. Not all of them, but and they did look after their own. But like even when Kennedy was running for president in the 60s, that was his Catholicism was used as a negative, because they were like, well, you're going to be loyal to the Pope. How can you be totally loyal to the United States? And, you know, obviously now, like that wasn't even a question with Joe Biden, you know, but the fact that even in the 1960s, whereas North American Christianity, particularly United States Christianity, has kind of rebranded into Christian, you know, and there are the sects, but politically Christian, you know, has become a more unifying thing rather than Catholics and Protestants, which in the past divided them. Now the commonality of Christian unites. Yeah.
I hate to wrap this up, but we have to come back and do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
But before we end this, we have this tradition where we ask every one of our guests to come up with a special historical figure that means something to them, because what we have is like a collection of cards that we have for our Patreons and for our guests. So you can pick any historical figure you want. We're going to put your name on the bottom of the card, and we're going to make it nice and cool. Okay. So which is the historical figure you would put your name on? What's someone who really means something to you?
Not Oliver Cromwell, anyway. He can go in himself. But no, Michael Collins. I'll go for an obvious Irish one, but Michael Collins. He worked. He fought in the Easter Rising as a, you know. Speaking of people who were able to work their way up the ranks, he fell into the leadership and ended up leading Ireland during the struggle of the War of Independence, and sadly was killed. I was actually down in Cork there in August. It was the 100th anniversary of his death, and they had there were 10,000 people came to the spot Bale-na-Blah where the ambush happened, where he was killed. And he's a really interesting figure because he was a man who represented so many contradictions and so much of the gray of history and not the black and white, that when he was sent over to England to negotiate the peace treaty, and what that resulted in was the Irish Free State, 26 counties, what was still part of the British Commonwealth, still had to pledge allegiance to the crown, And there were a lot of diehards in Ireland who did not like that. They wanted a 32-county Irish Republic, not 26 counties, because obviously Northern Ireland was now an entity. And this treaty cemented that. But he very much saw this, and literally in his own words, he says, this is the freedom to achieve freedom. You know, this will act as a stepping stone. You know, we can use this in the future. And that's ultimately what his opponents, Eamon de Valera, did, you know, but Eamon de Valera was the one who put his foot down and was like, no, I insist that we continue fighting. And he was like, no, we will be flattened by the British, because they're gonna, you know, come with a lot more this time, because they're not fighting World War I anymore. But it's such a sad moment in Irish history. Not the Irish Civil War in general is, because it's the most wasteful point, where we've just won our independence, and the first thing that we do with our independence is fall out with each other about how independent we're going to be. And Michael Collins was this wonderful go-between, because the Civil War was basically, it was former comrades who had fought side by side in the War of Independence against the British. Now all of a sudden, and because it was such, I suppose there's a war that is more about ideology than land in a lot of ways, bringing it full circle to what we were talking about. I mean, technically it is about who gets to control the land, and you know, but still, like, it very much came down to the ideology of what the country was going to be. And with that, Michael Collins was a great go-between between both sides, because both sides looked up to him. Yeah, fair enough, some of them saw him as a traitor as well, but ultimately he was a real big character. He was a real big charismatic character who, I think, given time, could have brought peace. But then he was killed in Cork. He was shot in an ambush, and the Civil War took a really dark turn, where there would be shootings and reprisals, and for everyone the anti-treaty forces would kill, then the pro-treaty forces, the Free State forces, would take some of their prisoners and execute them. They go, right, well, you killed him, so we're going to kill him. And it was just this tit for tat childishness. Very frustrating point in Irish history. Whereas Michael Collins, I think, could have brought something more to it, and had he have survived into the early years of the Irish Free State, I think the country could have well been different. That being said, a lot of his supporters ultimately flirted with fascism in the 1930s, the blue shirts in Ireland, and so that is a less desirable point. But I think obviously he was dead long before that. He died in 1922, but you know, it would be interesting to see his opinion. History. You know, and it would be interesting to see his opinion on that and his point on that. So there you go. Michael Collins. You know,
amazing,
and he also went to the moon.
Choice. Thank you so much, John. This was such a really good, wonderful time for me. The debates were awesome, the games were awesome, the roundtable was awesome. Like, thank you so much. Keep up what you're doing.
Thank you.
You are a beacon that like produces so much curiosity online, and hope to see you grow more and more, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Can I plug something before we go?
Yeah, go
absolutely. Anything you want.
So if anyone would like to support what I do, you can do so at patreon.com/John D. Ruddy. And I am currently working on Monarchs of England series. So I'm about to release part 3. It may already be released by now by the time you're watching this, where I'm right in the middle of Edward the Longshanks and Edward II, Edward III, which is why I kind of had a lot of that knowledge off the top of my head going into those debates. But yeah, your support is always greatly appreciated, and you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitch, Twitter at John D. Ruddy. You'll find me.
That's how it's done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.